All right, good evening, everyone. At 5:30, our meeting was called to order, upon which the board went into executive session. We will now begin our public session. If everyone could please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I need a motion for the approval of the agenda, which includes an addendum to the agenda, personnel consent agenda 1D, 4E, 4N, 4O, 4T, 4U, 4V, 4W, and 4X.
So moved.
Seconded?
Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Mercurio made the motion. Who seconded it?
I did.
Mr. Ballard. Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Mr. Evans?
Aye.
And Mrs. Weiss?
Aye, motion passes. I will ask for a motion of the approval of the minutes with the revision to those presented for August 5th. I ask that the minutes be revised for item 20-206 to reflect that the board revised policy EBEA, the use of face coverings, as presented, noting that students are required to wear masks in classrooms even when 6 feet of physical distancing is possible. There is no exception to the face covering requirement based on physical distancing. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes for the meetings of July 14th, 15th, 23rd, and August 11 and 14 as presented, and August 5th as revised?
So moved.
For second?
I think that was
That
Mr.
Mr.
Ballant and then
Ballant and
Mr.
Mr.
Evans.
Evans. Mr. Ballard, Mr. Evans. Okay.
Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
Mrs. Weiss?
Aye.
And Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Okay, minutes pass. We will now move on to the resident participation portion of our meeting. And just a reminder to our participants this evening, you are limited to 3 minutes. If you could come up to the podium when your name is called, state your name and address, and then you can begin speaking. The first people I would like to call are William Miller and Susan Watson. thank you. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Watson. Our next speaker is Mr. Todd Bassman. Thank you, Mr. Bassman. That song now will be stuck in my head for the rest of the evening. Thank you very much. Okay, moving along with our agenda.
Actually, Mrs.
Oh.
Weiss, may I?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Forstoffel.
First of all, Mrs. Watson and Mr. Bassman, thank you for coming tonight. We're very, very grateful that you're here and we're open with your concern. One of the things that we are committed to doing is, as we get a little deeper into this, is to convene the residents and the neighbors of our property. And for lack of a better term, we're going to call it the 100-Foot Club, but it's anybody that borders this property right here, and engage you in conversations, give more detail about the plan, answer your questions, and take your feedback. That meeting will be coming relatively soon. We'd kind of like to get this unusual school year open first, if you'll allow us just a little bit of grace to do that. But it's absolutely on our radar. It's a model that's worked for us in the past when we've done new construction. We are committed to being the best neighbors that we can with our great community, and part of that is making sure we engage you in that conversation. So you've given us several things to think about. There may be more. We will bring some more things to you to provide some feedback for, so we can engage in that dialogue as we move through with this project. Does that sound okay? Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Enjoy your evening. Well, I'm going to toss it right back to you, Mr. Forstoffel, for superintendent's agenda.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Weiss. First of all, welcome to those here in the room and those that are in the virtual room. We are grateful that you're here tonight. And it is my intent tonight to provide yet another in a series of updates on our Healthy Back to School plan as we aim to welcome back our students beginning September 3rd. First of all, before I do that, I'd like to, first of all, thank the board for their support, thank the board for their engagement, as we've done a tremendous amount of work in trying to make sure that this plan is the best for our students, the best for our staff, and the best for our community. So I'm going to walk you through some high-level important details that as this evolves, some things have crystallized, and kind of walk you through that. So some of these may be redundant a little bit, but there may be some new information. It's our commitment that each time we're together as a board and an administrative team that we would do an update of this sort so the board feels fully engaged in what the decisions are being made moving forward. There are a tremendous amount of thank yous that I need to give to the team that's worked incredibly hard to put this plan together, and I've started with the board, but the administrative team, many of whom are in the room here today, have worked countless hours to think through every angle and perception to make sure we have the best plan possible. Our building leaders, who have worked tirelessly to make sure that their building specific plans are in place and safe and are able to be implemented so we can engage our kids in the learning process. And then finally, our teaching staff has been deeply involved in providing us some think-abouts that as we needed to move forward, and we are committed to and looking forward to actually welcoming them back tomorrow as we welcome our teaching staff back and as they engage in some professional development. So with that being said, I'm going to kind of walk through this a little bit. I've been given the clicker, and let's see if I have the opportunity to use this correctly. Where am I pointing, Miss? Over there? Okay, so just some key dates. A lot of these, more specifics around these dates will be released either from the district level or from the building level, depending upon if there's some uniqueness to that. So you can see some high-level things there. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we welcome our teaching staff and certificated staff back tomorrow as they are engaged in what we believe is incredibly important professional development and training. And I want to thank the board for allowing us those 10 days to make sure that we're ready for kids, and I've shared that plan with the board. The following Monday, we will then begin to release what was on everybody's mind in the community. What class am I going to be in? Whose teacher am I going to have? What bus route am I going to have? All of those things are crystallizing right now, and we're anxious to release that to the community. Mr. Fritz and his team have done an amazing job of organizing, like they did in the spring, with Chromebook pickup, drop-off for those members of our great Sycamore student body that are choosing to learn from home. And we'll make sure we take care of them. And then you'll see there's 2 transition opportunities for our kids that come face-to-face. As you know, we are bringing half our kids face-to-face on the 3rd and the 4th, and that first day on the 8th will be a real virtual day class kickoff for our students in our virtual classroom. So we're looking forward to welcoming back our students, whether they be in a face-to-face model or we're going to engage with them in a virtual model as well. So those are some high-level. Building-specific dates will certainly come out from the building as well, but those are the ones that we wanted to do. And we wanted to make sure, because we gotten some questions about, especially that second one, when are we getting this? You know, when are we getting the class schedules? So we wanted to at least put out there that this is the week that those are going to come out. But we want to make sure we got it right, okay? All right, so let's dig in a little deeper. We've shared you in the past where we're at and kind of the balance between virtual class and face-to-face class in terms of our students. We wanted to drill down a little deeper with that. So as you can see in the virtual classroom, this is an update. You can see the total number of students that have enrolled in the virtual classroom. We have worked really hard, much to the credit of this Board of Education, for allocating additional staff, not only in this model, but in the face-to-face model, to keep those class sizes at a reasonable level for our virtual classroom teachers. So you can see the breakout there. We are honored, and I'm excited to welcome Molly Teslowitz, who will be our virtual classroom administrator. And there she is right there. Hi, Molly. We are thrilled that you're with us. Molly comes to us, as we've shared her credentials with you, just a tremendous background and experience related to teaching and learning and leadership and problem solving, all of which will be stretched to the nth degree in this model. She has been working diligently with Mrs. Wagner, Mrs. Neighbor, and the building leaders to make that connection and making sure that we have the best learning opportunity for our students that have chose to do it in a virtual manner. And Molly, we are thrilled that you're with us. You're going to be an exciting part of our team, and we have a lot of faith and trust in what you're going to do. So welcome. We are glad you're with us. You're welcome. All right, awesome. But we're not done yet. We're continuing to look at what other supports we need in the virtual area. We may need some additional support staff needed to support Mrs. Teslowitz and her team there. We've got what we think is a three-tiered model for support, including technology support, which we've talked about. And one of the important things that was important not only for us, but for students and families is that, 1,900 students are choosing virtually, but they still call their home school home. And we want to make sure we do everything we can to make sure that they feel still part of their individual school communities. And we continue to think through that. I know Molly's thinking about that. She's talking with the building leaders about how we can do that. So even though they're not physically in their home buildings, they still feel a part of that school community. That's an important component that we need to think about. So we're excited about that. Things are coming along really, really well. And then related to that, if we flip, Mr. Lewis is way ahead of me, we have talked to you about securing additional space for some of our virtual classroom teachers, and we've done that. For now, we're titling it the A's Virtual Learning Commons. We think it's going to be, we know it's going to be an exciting opportunity and supportive environment for our K through 6 virtual teachers. We made some tremendous inroads today with some furniture that we secured from a company that gifted those to us, and they've already been installed, individual partitions for our virtual teachers to make sure that they're safe. Mr. Fritz and his team has worked incredibly hard to make sure that we have the right infrastructure and technology bundles for our staff to do the best job that they can. So as you can see there, as of now, the K-6 virtual classroom, that will be their teaching space in the Kenwood space. We've made the conscious decision and strategic decision that our 7 through 12 virtual teachers will be housed in their individual buildings, simply because many of those folks are doing kind of a hybrid. Some of them may be doing a face-to-face bell or two and a virtual bell, or some of them may actually be doing a live streaming. And we think that that's best done in their buildings. So the junior high and the high school administration have really grabbed that and have found great spaces for them. Molly will still be absolutely connected with them and working with them, and so we think that's going to work really, really well. We do have some staff, as we are absolutely accommodating the needs of our staff as we are with our students that have medical needs that have been documented, and we have worked individually due to Mr. Wallace's work to make sure that they are taken care of, and if they're in the virtual staff, they're able to do that from home and work remotely from home if they have a medical need and they have a safety concern. So that's been an interesting puzzle piece, but we're all about taking care of our staff as well, and we want to make sure that they're well taken care of, but they will have certainly the support that they need even if they're doing virtual instruction from home. Okay? All right. So moving on, let's do the face-to-face. Mr. Lewis? That's all right. There we go. Okay, so here's the total students. You can see that number there. Again, we have looked really hard at how we keep the class sizes as low as possible to ensure that we have the right physical distancing. We are in the process right now of physically, now that we've got kids assigned to classes and teachers in classes, that we're physically mapping out all of those classrooms so they look and to the best possible ability, and that they are distanced in the right possible way. And we're excited. This is an opportunity, and I think, again, to the Board of Education's credit, allowing us to utilize some resources to hire additional staff has allowed us to accomplish that goal. And at K-6, that 1 to 15 ratio is a really good one. 7 through 12, 1 to 20. There's probably some variances in that, but I think that's a really good ratio and allows us to put a safe plan in place. Again, once you get into the buildings and we start everything up and running, you will see a tremendous amount of communication to students and staff. around precautionary signs, barriers to make sure that we're doing the right things from a distancing aspect. We also know that coaching our students is an important thing that we need to do. So how do you do that, right? You provide them models, and so we've got a lot of safety videos that are done in a really engaging way to allow that, and so our students can look at it. I think even Mr. Aviator's part of that at some point. So we know that our students will just grab hold of that. And we're hopeful, and we're actually expecting our students to rise to the level and rise up on this one, and certainly take care of themselves and take care of those of their classmates as they maneuver around the building if they're in the face-to-face. Again, I've referenced this several times, but to allow us to implement these kinds of class sizes in both the virtual and the face-to-face model required some resource allocation and the support of the Board of Education, and you've done that. And I'm incredibly grateful that you've allowed us to do that, and you continue to challenge us to what else that we need to make sure that this plan's right. And so I'm very, very grateful for that. So,
Mr.
Okay.
Forstall,
Yes.
just a question. Do you know when the physical mapping will be complete? Do you have a schedule on that?
yeah, I think it's pretty close to being done, and it would be our intent, Mr. Evans, to share that with the board. I don't suspect it's going to take much longer. Probably within the next week or so, we'll have that all done.
And my follow-up question is, you look at contact tracing and 6-foot social distancing,
Yeah.
which is really kind of the output, I think, of some of the physical mapping. When would that process sort of be aligned so you could have an idea within certain classrooms you've hit the 6-foot distancing and aligned with the County of Health kind of
Yeah.
guidelines, and then the whole contract tracing process based
Yeah.
on that?
The
map?
contract tasting process you'll see referenced in the back of this, as we have a certain flow chart that we work with the Hamilton County. You'll see how that process works. The mapping that we're going to put in place ascribes to 6 foot, but remember, it may not exactly be 6 foot in every single classroom. We're going to approach that as best that we can, but we'll show that to you when we're ready. All right?
Mr. Forstoffel,
Yep.
would the board have an opportunity to go into a building or two and see how
Yeah.
this looks?
Sure. I think
Okay.
that'd be great. I think that would be a great opportunity, not only to see physically in our current buildings, but to get you into the Kenwood space as well.
I would love that.
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely. It's been on our minds. Okay? All right. Some questions that we had around some of our specials, and when I say specials, I mean like art, music, PE, and so forth, specifically at the K-6. So as we look to offer those in the face-to-face learning model, we've put some things in place and made some modifications to that. I think first and foremost, you need to understand that those opportunities will be given to our kids when they're in the face-to-face model. It's going to look a little different than what it normally does during it. So basically, you will see here that they're going to be held in their special area classroom or outside, certainly if possible. That's certainly recommended. You will see some very specific things that are done per content area. But we've had to reduce a little bit in terms of the amount of time per class, down to about 30 minutes. In some classes, in normal years, it's been a little higher than that. But what we've done is, instead of doing it in many of those circumstances, you may have art one day, music the next day, PE the next day. We've kind of blocked it off in that you will most likely have, for example, music every day for 5 days, okay? And then you'll flip to art every day for 5 days. That's a way that we're kind of limiting a little bit cohort and those kinds of things, and movement and those kinds of things. It makes a lot of sense when you really step back and think about it. But the reality of it is those kids are going to get those opportunities. It's going to look a little different. What we've had to do, though, is because it is a little different and it's kind of a condensed time, we're not going to assign specific grades to those classes. Grades everywhere else, but we're not going to assign specific grades to art, PE, music, media, computer science, and so forth. But the kids will still have the opportunity to enjoy those sessions when they're in the face-to-face model. Okay? All right. And then I kind of broke it out just a little bit in terms of what's the differences between K4 and 5-6 in the virtual classroom. So basically what we're advocating here is we have asked our face-to-face teachers to really develop the virtual classroom activities for our students to do or to engage with at home. And they have special planning time that's dedicated for them to develop, for lack of a better term, kind of a menu board that our students can reference, and whoever their learning partners are at home that they can look at. And within their schedule, they do have time allocated each day that they can engage in those learning activities, whether it be an art learning activity, a music learning activity, and so forth. And those activities that are being prepared by the face-to-face classroom teacher for the virtual students is going to mirror what's happening in the face-to-face model, because we want them to be parallel. And then so the learning partners of our students at home can look at those menu boards and say, okay, well, here's what I can do. Here's a choice that I can do with my child on Monday in art, or Tuesday in art, or Wednesday in art. And then they can work through there so those kids can engage their minds in those kinds of and their bodies in those kinds of activities as well.
And will those, Mr.
Yep.
Forstoffel, will those students and their parent or learning partner, will they have an opportunity to actually interact with teachers in those specialties, or how is that going?
There won't be any.
Okay.
There won't be any teachers directly interacting. It's going to be more of a menu board. We're going to continue those face-to-face teachers. We'll continue then to have. We'll continue to monitor those and update those activities. If there's a question or concern, we'll funnel that information through our administrator there, who will make those connections if necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. All right. And then similarly at grades 5 and 6, thank you, Mr. Lewis. This is very similar. The only thing that's a little different about 5 and 6 is that there will be some teacher-directed and live streaming with general music and choir here for the virtual students at the Green School. That is a slight difference, and we're going to do some live streaming if at all possible. And then you can see art, PE, computer science, and STEAM, same kind of concept. Menu board, activities, time allocated, and then the mirror what's going on in the face-to-face will certainly mirror what goes on in the virtual special. So we think this is a great plan, and I'm excited. It took a lot of thought and a lot of collaboration to make sure that this works out really well, and we've aligned our staff to make sure that they have the right time in order to provide these activities for kids. Okay? All right, let's move on. One of the things, and I want to again thank the board that you've challenged us to think about the live streaming concept, which is a good one, and we're moving forward on that. We've talked a little bit about the purchase of materials in terms of the actual hardware that's needed to do that. We've got 30 of those bundles, for lack of a better term, purchased. We're in the process of dividing those out between the junior high and the high school. Simply, if you go back to what I just said about those hybrid teachers that may be doing, we want to make sure we have that. We're continuing to think if we need more of those, but in the interim, the principals at each of those buildings are thinking about, if there's one camera and it's not being used every bell, obviously, then staff could share that if it's done in the right way. So we don't want to hinder simply because we don't have all of them in yet. We're going to get creative with our schedule so those bundles can be used so we can live stream those courses. So again, since this is new for many of our teachers, and I'm learning a little bit about this in my work at Xavier, you got to learn how to do it, right? And so we built into our professional development plan specific coaching and training with our teachers that are going to be doing this to how to effectively engage students via the live stream medium. Okay?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
The benefits of the live stream media over the remote learning technology, just what's the instructional benefit or the difference?
Well, I think, from a live stream, you get real time, at that moment. And, it goes from day to day. You've got that teacher right there interacting with the virtual kids on the other side. So
Yeah.
I think that's one benefit of a live stream.
Do we get that out of the other remote session, the other virtual
Do,
sessions
but in
as
different
well?
forms, I think.
And that's why I'm trying to figure out the
Yeah.
benefit as you kind of roll out this
Yeah.
technology. What's the benefit of the live stream versus, the webcam on the computer, the other webcams we have?
Yeah, Mrs. Wagner, you want to come up? I know you've been working with the team on that.
Yeah. But he's a technology guy, not an instructional
Sure.
designer, so
Sure.
this is more of an instructional design question.
So for the classes that we're looking at live streaming, those are kind of those singleton classes. So I go back to the conversation we had in July about French 4, let's say. Okay, so you've got one teacher that teaches that course, but you've got a handful of students that have chosen to go virtual. So that way, by live streaming those kids and that teacher, is it not coming through? Sorry.
Yeah, so our virtual,
By live, is that better?
here,
Oh, okay.
there you go.
Sorry, okay, thank you. Sorry about that, so let me back up then. So in the situations that we're looking at specifically for the live streaming are kind of those singleton courses, if you will. So you've got one course of French 4 offered with one teacher. So we want those kids to still have access to that content expert. So we've got a handful of kids, let's say, that have chosen to be in the virtual classroom. So by using the live streaming technology in that particular classroom, the students still have access to that content area expert. Think of some of your AP classes as well. And they can still interact with that teacher as opposed to having a different teacher maybe that may not have that same background and skill set, and also for if there's only just a small group, to have one teacher remotely teaching just that small group, again, doesn't really make sense. So that's the main reason, is to make sure that our kids still have access to those experts that know that content, that are gifted in that area in terms of teaching and learning. From an instructional perspective, and whether you're doing live streaming, whether you're doing virtual 100%, whether you're doing face-to-face, engagement is the key. And so just like in the face-to-face classroom, we don't want teachers standing and lecturing all bell. They need to be interacting with their kids. That would still be happening in the live streaming. That still would happen in a virtual Google Meet session or a Blackboard Collaborate session as well. So that's one of the pieces in terms of that professional learning as we're teaching teachers how to use the technology. Also, how to be intentional in making sure they're still interacting with those kiddos that are being streamed into their classes.
So let me just, as a follow-up, so for the small groups you're talking about, does that translate down to the gifted courses? As I go down to like 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, would they get the live streaming because of the smaller groups?
No, we're able to cover that with the teachers themselves. We've got the
Okay.
gifted teachers that can do that. So from a staffing perspective, we're good to go there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Mrs. Wagner. Okay, so great question. Thank you for that. So moving on, we're continuing to work through extracurriculars, athletics, other things. I'll share a little bit about the latest update with athletics in just a moment, but we're moving forward and engaging our students in athletics, marching band, and theater, and a lot of that is based on Ohio High School Athletic Association, GMC guidelines, and continuing to work through that as long as safety protocols are in place. I know our band's been doing their thing this summer, which is a great thing, and I want to thank Dr. Ewing and his team for making sure that they've got everything in place. One of the things, as you know, we are very blessed to have a robust menu of clubs and so forth that are in our buildings every single day, and in and out, students in and out. And I'd like to just take a pause on that just momentarily for the first month of the year to see how things go until we figure out and put some more deep thought and study around protocol with many of our clubs that are coming in and out of the building. We want to make sure we get the protocols in place following a typical school day to make sure we've got things cleaned and those kinds of things. We've communicated to our outside groups that we're going to press pause on them coming in as well, so we want to align that. I'm not saying we're not going to do that, but I want to take a little bit of extra time, especially that first month since we don't start till September, to make sure we get that right before we open up the doors on all of our clubs. We know they're great for kids. We want to be able to do it. We want to make sure our focus is on the normal school day, and then figure out how we do those other things.
Mr. Forstoffel,
Yep.
will the Champions after-school program still happen, or is that falling into the category you're speaking of?
It'll still happen. Yeah.
Will happen. Okay.
It'll
thank
still.
you.
Oh, absolutely. We don't. Yeah, and they've had a program this summer that we worked really closely with, and we monitor that and so forth, and they're really falling under a lot of the JFS, Job and Family Services guidelines put out through the state. Yep, for childcare. Okay, so
just on that subject, sorry, on the club side, why are the clubs any different than the other sports that are out there? Why are we concerned about clubs versus sports. In my mind, it's the other way around, so that's why I'm struggling on that one.
That's a good question, Mr. Evans. I think just simply the sheer volume, and if we open that up, if you think about a high school and what that looks like at the end of the day and throughout of our buildings, we're not sure exactly yet, although we've done a lot of planning about the impact of what it's going to take us to regroup from a normal school day to get ready for the next day. And instead of just going full bore on those, I wanted to pull back. Some part of our athletic training that's going on right now is outside, so that's a little different. I know there's at least one that's inside, volleyball.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to scale it down just for a very close review of that.
We've got water polo inside and stuff, and we get classes all day long. So that's why I kind of just struggle
Yep.
with, an outlet for kids that are,
Yep.
cooped up and looking for something.
Yep.
That's, if you can do sports, that just seems to be a tough one to delay on.
And I understand. Ultimately, our goal would be to do it. I just want to make sure we do it and do it right. So, and then athletics, you've heard a lot about that. The governor held a press conference on earlier this week and indicated that he's going to issue an order that we've yet to see that will allow fall sports to take place, including contact sports. So Mr. Harden and his team has been working with the ADs in the conference to ensure that if that were allowed, we're able to do that in a safe manner. I think at some point I shared the large document with the safety protocols in place for fall athletics. We continue to review that. We expect the governor to limit the number of spectators that are allowed at these. And for many of them, ours is not an issue, but obviously for football it will be, which would limit us really to allowing basically parents of those participants, including the band and cheerleaders, to attend. So we'll work that out. We'll work the numbers on it. If and when we go with football, we're going to be able to make sure that those that are directly connected with the participants of that event will be able to see. And for those that can't, we're going to look at live streaming so people can tune in virtually and watch those events as well. And then you can see some other details there. Okay? So more details to come. And then this is a big one. It's really important to everybody, as it should be. One of the things that we want to make sure we have a very detailed process in is what is our decision tree that allows us and really drives our thinking around if we would have either a suspected, a probable, or a confirmed case within our school communities. And we have worked very closely with the Hamilton County Health Department and have really modeled this after what they've recommended that we do. So you can see that there are basically 3 buckets. You either have a suspected, you have a probable, and a confirmed. And there are specific protocols for each of those in terms of what you need to do in the event you have anyone in each of those specific areas. It's very detailed. Mrs. Farron, Mrs. Spencer, and the team have worked very closely on this. One of the things that I would call out is when you get into either the probable or confirmed, and you have knowledge that, the first trigger point is to contact the Hamilton County Health Department, who will work as a point of contact for us and work hand in hand with us to make some decisions along this decision tree. And that would include determining contact tracing, reaching out to that, determining who needs to be contact traced, and so forth. So it's a very clear decision tree that we need and we have in place. One of the things that we looked at is, if you go down to the dark green at the bottom of those right there, what happens is after you work through that decision tree and you get to the point of a student or teacher coming back to school, that's really now in the hands of the Hamilton County Health Department, and they'll need to offer some kind of release to a student or a teacher in order for them to return to school. And that really kind of takes that out of our hands. We've developed a great relationship with the Hamilton County Health Department. We have a point of contact assigned to us. Our district point of contact is Mrs. Farron, who's worked all summer to work through this and has really put the finishing touches on this right here. So it's a model. I think on the far right you will see the close contact and what that's defined as. And, you know, we've known that. We just wanted to make sure we clarified that very carefully. So, okay? A lot of detail in that, but that's what we're going to follow. Okay?
Mr. Forstoffel?
Yes, Mr. Comerford, yes.
I have a question on the chart.
Sure.
This is a specific case.
Uh-huh.
A face-to-face learner,
Okay?
asymptomatic. They're feeling fine but need to stay at home. What's their learning option?
Is it an illness that is any student that stay home?
Confirmed COVID-19
Yeah.
but asymptomatic and they're feeling fine, so they're home for
Yeah.
the 14 days,
Yeah.
but they could be learning.
Yeah.
What's the case for them?
Well, we have students in a typical year that need to be home for an extended period of time, and that's when the teachers take over and engage those students in learning, provide opportunities, engagement. You know, if they're a secondary student, they can access their work on Blackboard. And so those are typical things that we would do anyway during that. We don't want to do anything to interrupt their learning.
So they would not be joining the virtual.
No.
They would do the face-to-face
Right.
like they would be.
Like
in
if they had an
previous years.
extended absence. Yep, exactly. Is that our clarification? Yep. Okay?
Mr. Forstoffel,
Yep.
if you have, here it says a confirmed COVID outbreak is more than one case, I'm assuming that is per building.
Yes.
What does that do to the rest of the building? Is that a shutdown of a building, or is that based on number of people affected, or how are we going to determine if we have
Yep.
2 cases in a building, or at what point do we shut down a building?
Yeah, and again, that's conversations we would have with the Hamilton County Health Department. It will get into the amount of contact tracing that we need to think about in terms of a spread, I guess, is for lack of a better term. Then you get into operational issues that if there's the realization of it, if we have a number of staff that have to be quarantined, then it gets into operation, then we'll have to make that decision. But we will consult very closely with the Hamilton County Health Department, who will provide some guidance on that.
Will we update the community, parents, when there is positive cases in a building?
There is specific communications that is drafted and recommended by the Hamilton County Health Department that we will issue. Yep, and the county schools are using those. Yep.
Mr. Forstoffel?
Yep.
Are we going to do any testing of our contact tracing or abilities as far as, you know, like we do a fire alarm drill, essentially?
Yeah.
Have there been any plans to say, okay, something happened, there's an incident, and how does that ripple through? How do we know which kids are in which class, which bus, and be able to at least practice that before we?
Yeah. One of the layers that we need to think about, Mr. Evans, is we need to make sure that we have very clear delineation of where every child is at all times. And sometimes, you know, this is a simplistic way, but there's other ways in terms of a specific unchanged seating charts that don't change. Because when you get that, you need to know where every kid was consistently based. And that's a very clear recommendation from the Hamilton County Health Department. In terms of practicing that, I haven't really thought about that, but it's, you know, we could think about in terms of what that might look like and run a trial on that. But we'll think about that.
I mean, I would say that's important. I mean, more than thinking about it, I'd say, you know,
Yep.
something's going to happen.
Yep.
Unless we think we're not going to have an incident. I just think
No.
someone will have a cold, and it may just be a flu, but there's going to be a reaction to that, and it'd be nice to quickly be able to say, you know, we had that lockdown, we have a plan, we practiced it, and it's not sort of a
Kind of a scenario, tabletop
fire
scenario.
drill or something like that
Yeah.
that we haven't done ever before. We practice tornado drills and everything else.
Yeah, and we do safety drills as well.
Yep.
Yep. Good point. Good point.
Will you follow up with us on that?
Yes, I will. Okay, so moving on to the higher level, we have taken, as we've said before, a risk assessment and data team. We continue to work with our healthcare professionals and our public health officials, and we're starting to drill down on a dashboard that we need to think about. And some of these we've shown before. I want to thank Mr. Mercurio for his legwork up front in developing the dashboard, and we're beginning to finalize that. As you can see, there's a combination of state data, Hamilton County data, some of our more localized data, and then even drilling down even more into more school-specific data. You know, I'll reference a couple of those. Certainly we're going to track attendance data. The temperature data really looks at, the nurses have set kind of a threshold of 100 100 degrees and up as being certainly concerning, and so we're going to look at how we track that as well. You know, we'll continue to consider what a random mask audit looks like. You know, we're going to be very stringent on that simply because we have to. And then the nursing data really is more localized, typical things that we do anyway from the nurse's office. So we're looking at how we track that data. I know Mrs. Farron's collaborating with Mr. Fritz to see how we get real-time data that can be done via an app. We'll have an update on that at some point. So, Mr. McKeer, anything from your perspective that you want to offer with that? We have another meeting set up for Monday that we're going to revisit this and hopefully put the finishing touches on it.
Yeah, I think you've covered it. It's all coming together.
Yep.
Can you guys just review the county level, you know, color-coded system and how that's playing into your data team and your risk assessment team? I mean, is that just one more, I'm assuming that's one more data point for all of you.
It is, and you know, as a review, you know, the state has assigned color codes to each county, and it's yellow, orange, red, and purple. Purple is certainly at what's called a level 4. We've talked about as a board and as a team that if we got to a level 4 from a county aspect, we would go to full remote. When we get into red and orange, and right now the county is orange, the last I'd heard. And so then we're drilling down into the different layers of data embedded in that. One of the things that we've committed to doing is not simply resting our decisions simply on the county color level. And I think that's what's unique about our plan is that we're drilling down even to more localized data, school-based data that's more relevant for our school community. So, yep. That help? All right, you're welcome. All right, and then finally I'll wrap up. You know, we've talked a lot about, you know, healthy bodies and making sure the health protocols, but we can never forget and not attend to the minds of our students and staff as they come back. And I think a little bit about when March 12th hit, and it's been 6 months since we've been in our school community, and you know, you could technically qualify that as somewhat of a trauma. So we want to make sure we're taking care of everybody once they return. So Mrs. Zelvey and her team have built into some of those days, the 10 days, some really necessary and leveraging some local agencies and professionals to really provide some trauma-informed care for our staff, some self-care for educators, because we absolutely have to take care of them as well. With an organization called 1 in 5, and then we'll continue to evaluate as we move forward. And as you can see there, we're addressing all of our employee groups as well to make sure that they're able to take care of themselves and take care of each other. And then, as we move forward, we want to provide support for our parents and caregivers and for students as well. And a lot of that are specific sessions that we want to do. There's one on August the 26th on mask wearing. And so we're going to provide some sessions on that. And then other sessions on supporting students who may have some anxiety and fear and worry about coming back to school. And we're partnering with our health partner, Cincinnati Children's, to do those. And we're thinking about other sessions that we want to do for our parents who are so important to our partnership in helping our students be successful. And then you can see some references there about some sessions for students as well that we think is really, really important. So again, never understating the importance of a healthy body, but also ensuring that we're taking care of healthy minds as well. So that is my update to where we're at now. I'm very pleased with where we're at. We are excited and energized to welcome our staff back tomorrow and to engage them in professional learning so we can be ready for our students. So, and I want to thank the board for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Forstoffel. You guys are clearly keep moving the ball down the field, to use a sports analogy.
Yep.
And we appreciate it. Does any questions or comments from the board? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on in the agenda, I need a motion for the approval of the 2020-2021 student handbooks.
So moved.
Second.
So this is an annual approval that we asked the board to do, and it's a little different this year as we've had to make some adjustments based on the changes to what school's going to look like. And I want to thank Mrs. Neighbor and the building principals who've worked hard on this, and again, thank the board for giving some feedback on some things that you have recognized that we needed to attend to. Hopefully we've taken your feedback and we've made the modifications based on the things that you saw were important that we included in there. So,
Okay. Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
Mrs. Weiss?
Aye.
And Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Motion passes. I need a motion for the approval of the commissioning agent services.
So moved, David. Mr. Evans?
Seconded?
we have engaged on July 15th, you authorized Mr. Lewis to advertise for commissioning agents services for the junior high and green. They were due on July 24th, and these are the companies listed below that submitted their respective rankings. There were 8 of them. And based on the analysis and the interview process that Mr. Lewis put in place with his team, we are asking for your authorization for him to enter in negotiations with Four Seasons Environmental for the purpose of securing a contract for commissioning agent services for this project, and the project being junior high and green. So, Mr. Lewis, is there anything in addition to that you'd like to offer?
Mr. Lewis, this is funded out of the bond levy, right?
Yes.
Any other questions from the board? Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mrs. Weiss?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
Motion passes. I need a motion for the approval of the designee for transportation routing.
So moved.
Seconded?
This is a standard approval that we request every year. We need a designee to make transportation routing decisions. Certainly that's Mr. Miller's purview and his responsibility. But I will take this opportunity to publicly thank Mr. Miller, Mr. Huber, and his team down there who have worked incredibly hard to make sure we have the transportation all lined up for our students that are coming back in a face-to-face model.
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
And Mrs. Weiss?
Aye. Motion passes. I need a motion for the approval of the school bus stops for the 2020-2021 school year.
So moved, Mr. Evans.
Seconded?
So again, annual review or approval, as I stated in the presentation, we're aiming for a release sometime during the week of August 24th for our families, and I know they're anxiously waiting for that.
Okay, any questions from the board? Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
And Mrs. Weiss?
Aye. Motion passes. I need a motion for the approval of the contract with Langsford Learning.
So moved?
Second.
This is an agreement with Langsford Learning Center for educational placement for a student with disability for the 2020-21 school year. You see the amount listed. This is specialized instruction, I believe, in reading for this student.
Any questions from the board? Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
And Mrs. Weiss?
Aye. Motion passes. Mr. Forstoffel?
Just 2 quick things, Mrs. Weiss. Our residents that offered comments today kind of just hinted at I wanted to share, and that's our commitment moving forward to continue to engage our community in the design process in the construction of our buildings once we're ready to get started with that. So we're in the process of determining when those events will happen so we can engage our neighbors, most specifically around this campus right here. So please look for that. We've identified the addresses, and we just need to begin our communication with that. And then the other thing I want to end on a good news story is that I want to thank our Sycamore Bridges team who have collaborated with one of our staff members to offer or to solicit mentoring and mentee and tutoring support for some of our students that may need it. So they've, Mrs. Drasnan has worked with one of our teachers, Mrs. LeBlanc from the high school, to think about how for those students that may be impacted by the changes in school may need some additional support, that may not be able to access other kinds of tutoring services, that we can reach out into our community and offer that if so being. So I would look for that. We know what a great thing Sycamore Bridges has been. It's typically been material needs for families, and that's a great thing. This is a little different approach to it, but we're not afraid of different. And I think this will be a good thing for our community. So please look for that. And that's all I have.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, moving on, I need a motion for the approval of the treasurer's consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes, thank you. Just a few things that I would like to point out in the consent agenda. A little bit later in the meeting, you are going to hear an update on the budget impact for COVID. One of the items that is on the agenda is just under Emergency Relief Fund. That's additional funding that we've received from the federal government through the state of Ohio to support some of our needs that are due to coming back to school, being able to support our students and do that in a safe manner. So that the total of that budget for the district that'll be coming to Sycamore is about $258,000. You'll also see that we are working with Moeller and Ursuline and CHCA. Approximately $97,000 in that funding is being administered by the district on their behalf. So we've been working with them diligently to get some additional technology. They've been buying some PPE and other sanitation items, so been working with them on that. Other than that, these are some other things that you're going to hear a little bit more about in the COVID report, some of the transfers that we've made from one budget line to another to support that. And then also dollars in transfers from the general fund to support our capital improvement items, and those are primarily some of the things that we'd already talked about and had approved, such as bus purchase, some dollars for paving and those kinds of things, and then also in the technology area to support purchases such as the technology bundles that we're going to talk about in a bit under COVID, and other Chromebooks, things like that, to help with our technology department.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Weber. Does anyone have any questions about the consent agenda? Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Mr. Evans? Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
And Mrs. Weiss.
Aye, motion passes. I need a motion for the approval of financial reports.
So moved.
Seconded.
Okay. There are a couple key things that I just want to point out in this report that are items that we had talked about occurring based on number one, the delay of property tax collection by the county auditor. And then the second one is just that the state is going to be continuing down the path of some reduction in state budget funding. So first, just addressing the real estate taxes within the financial report, you'll notice that those dollars are down significantly from July of last year to the end of July this year, and that was expected. There was a month delay in collection of property taxes by the county auditor, and so we anticipated that we would have a lower receipt of those funds through the end of July. What we have also seen, though, is that we've continued to get some advances in August. At this point in time, we are about at 91% of collection of where we were last year by the time we had received all that second half collection, and we have not, and it's not been completed yet. So I think in our 5-year forecast, we projected something like a 4 to 5% decline potentially because of delinquencies. And just based on where we are right now, I think that we will be okay with that projection. I don't think it's going to be something like, a 20% reduction or something really catastrophic. We're seeing those dollars come in. Now, this is just the first half of the fiscal year. We still have the collections that will occur next spring, so we'll have to continue to monitor that depending on how the economy continues to recover. But what we're seeing so far in terms of our collections is that we're doing okay. Delayed, but not a huge cause for concern yet at this point. But I would anticipate that we'll see the final collection occur in September, as opposed to last year it was complete in August. So not a great area of concern at this point. The second thing is just, you can see that our state budget funds are down from last year. Again, it's not a huge amount of money because we don't get a lot of state funding, but they are going to continue the reductions or have a similar reduction in this fiscal year to what they did last fiscal year at the end of the year. For us, that's about $600,000 for the entire fiscal year. One good piece of information is that the changes that were made to provide us some relief because of us being a high impact district carried forward, so that the same $1 million that was restored in last year's budget is restored in this year's budget. So that's good news that was carried forward. Expenditures are just about the same as last year, very similar. You do see that we have reduced our capital allocation from last year to this year. That's the transfers amount, because we are doing most of our capital improvements through our bond issue dollars. Are there any questions on just the July financial report?
Yeah, Mrs. Weber, I just want to confirm something you said earlier about the real estate taxes. You're projecting net when it all comes in, so timing issue aside, that it would be 5% lower than the previous year?
That was what was included in our 5-year forecast, but at this point in time, I'm not even sure that we'll realize that much of a decline.
But year over year, not
Yes.
something that this
Yes.
district is accustomed to, you expect real estate taxes to be less.
That's what is included in our 5-year forecast at this point in time, because we do have several impacted industries within our district, one being hotels. I've not heard, just in talking with our cities, that they are seeing any other major delinquencies at this point, but we still have a ways to get through the recovery of this. So that decline really wasn't, it was for the entire year. So we're seeing that we're still collecting as fairly well in this second half of the fiscal year, or the second half of the calendar year for tax purposes. We'll still have to watch next January timeframe to see if the recovery continues.
Okay. So that's a good metric for the health of our particular economy. So as you come across any other metrics like that, if you could share those with the board, I'd appreciate it. I think all of us would like to see that.
Any other questions from the board? Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Mercurio,
Aye.
Mr. Evans,
Aye.
Mrs. Weiss,
Aye.
Mr. Ballant,
Aye.
and Mr. Comerford.
Aye.
Motion passes. On to the treasurer's agenda. Mrs. Weber?
This is, if you recall, typically we would provide a fiscal year update, and I don't believe that this was in your original board packet, but it is on the screen here, so if any of you would need to move to be able to see the presentation, you may want to do that now. Typically, this would be a presentation that we would have given in July, but because we had such a lengthy agenda with the Healthy Back to School plan, we delayed it to this month. So, Mr. Lewis, if you could forward the slide, and I don't know if I could maybe get the clicker as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is just give you an overview of all funds, so beyond just the general fund. Also looking at bond retirement, our capital improvement dollars, child nutrition, federal funds, and so on and so forth. Then provide an overview on an update on our general fund, the same items that we look at on a quarterly basis in terms of revenue, expenses, and then the district's financial parameters. And then a bit more in-depth information about expenses for our other funds. Okay. First item is just revenue for all funds. And as you're looking at this chart, the general fund is in green, capital improvement is in yellow, bond retirement is in blue, child nutrition is black, other local is the darker blue, and state and federal grants are in brown. This is a chart that we'll never probably ever see again that will look like this. You know, typically the general fund is the green piece of the pie would be the largest piece of the pie for us. This year, the reason that in terms of revenue, and we all know this, is that we did issue our debt from the November bond issue and received about $127.5 million that went into the capital improvement fund. So those dollars all came in last year and is making up the biggest piece of our overall revenue picture. Okay, so a little bit wonky for this year, but understandable based on the situation. So this one looks a little bit more normal, the same setup. The general fund is green, capital improvement is yellow, the bond retirement is blue, and the child nutrition is black, and the other local is blue, and the state and federal grants are in brown. So this is more typical of what we would see in our regular expense patterns. One of the things that we'll see next year is it'll kind of go the opposite, likely, in that yellow piece of the pie will get bigger as we continue to spend more bond issue dollars. Right now, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, that's just mostly those dollars that we had already utilized out of our capital improvements for projects that were typically paid out of our reserve. And as far as the bond issue is concerned, we had some architect's fees that were expensed out of that area. Okay. All right. You get it? Okay. All right. So moving on, as far as our general revenue fund is concerned, and we've talked about this in the past as well, is that in looking at where our actual results were, those numbers are in green. Yellow is what we had projected, and then the blue is where we were last year at the end of the fiscal year. So you can see that comparison. This year, we did not see, or as far as the 2019-20 year, we really didn't see much of an impact on our overall revenue in terms of actual receipts. because our tax collection was complete prior to the pandemic occurring. And we saw a much lower reduction in state budget funds than what we had projected as of even the May 5-year forecast. If you recall, we found out that about $1 million was restored between that May forecast and when we actually received those funds at the end of in June. So that's the variance that you see between what was projected in the 5-year forecast and what was actually received by the end of June. The increase from last year is due primarily, if you remember, the second half of last calendar year for the 2018-19 fiscal year was when we had the very odd situation with the change in tax reform, and we had early collection that caused lower collection. It was just really a timing piece. So hopefully we're never going to have to talk about that again, but we're going to have to talk about the impact of the pandemic for a really long time, I think. Okay. As far as expenses go, we had revised our 5-year forecast in May. Our initial parameter for the school year was $79.3 million. We reduced that down by $1 million in May because of the impact we were seeing because of the pandemic and just a lot of our discretionary spending not occurring, some reduction in staffing costs because of reduced field trips, overtime pay, those kinds of things. We ended up almost about 1.3 million below the parameter when you look at total costs, and right around 1% over where we were in the prior year. So we did realize those cost reductions, but many of those are just going to be one-time things just because of not having those discretionary dollars needing to be spent at the end of the last fiscal year in fourth quarter. And we're continuing to see those kinds of things. We have to kind of keep reminding ourselves when those happen, like when we approve contracts and we compare year-to-year costs for things. A lot of it is because we didn't incur those costs for the last quarter of the school year last year. Okay, and overall, just comparing our parameters and how we look at this on our annual 5-year forecast. On top of those operating costs, we also include dollars for our energy conservation bonds, for our certificates of participation for the district office. And you can see those amounts outlined there. The energy conservation bonds, those dollars are the cost of that debt. It has been paid for by our energy savings, which is great. We made that commitment for the COPS for the district office back when we built that building to update our space and make sure that we had adequate space for our district office. In comparing again, looking at that $79.3 million parameter that was originally set, right around $78 million, so about $1.3 million less in expenses. Those are dollars that were added to our reserve for future costs. And when we get to the next presentation where we talk about the impact of the COVID spending that we're going to need to support our Healthy Schools reopening plan, you'll see that those dollars are definitely going to be needed for next year. Overall, in comparing our total expenses in the general fund, what's not included in that trend that we look at for our parameters are the dollars that we transfer from the general fund to support capital projects such as paving. Last year was the second phase of the science wing update. So those dollars are about $4.8 million. So total general fund is about $82.8 million. When you look at the dollars added to the reserve for last year, it was about $5 million that was added overall. Okay. So are there any questions about the general fund? Okay. If not, I'm just going to go through quickly the bond retire, or the different other funds, so you can see what the spending is as part of our overall appropriation. Bond retirement, we had the bonds that had been for the 98 bonds, the Mapledale bonds, energy conservation bonds, and we had our first payment. We had a small interest payment on the new issue from 2019 from that bond issue. This is an area that we'll continue to see go up in future years. One thing that I did not include in here was the payment of the payoff, which was almost $130 million for our bond anticipation notes, because it was basically just an accounting transaction. Okay, capital improvement, again, this is primarily just the items such as the science lab wing, buses, paving, those types of things, plus some initial architect's fees for the bond issue. Child nutrition, nearly $2 million in costs. And one of the things I just want to point out is that if you look back at our revenue, the child nutrition fund, because they were not really in operation, only with some of the meal deliveries out into the community, we basically didn't operate the whole last quarter of the school year. They ate into their reserve by about $150,000. They still have right around $500,000 left in reserve, but that's an area that we're going to have to continue to monitor as we continue to see that their operation is impacted. This year it's going to be just because we're going to have fewer students in the building, and likely because of some of the things that they're going to have to do to continue operations on site are going to have very similar costs, other than potentially some food costs that will go down, but you'll still have to see very similar staffing, I believe. So I think we'll continue to see them eating into their reserve this year. So we'll continue to work with Mrs. Warren and Mr. Lewis to monitor that area.
I asked a question about the child nutrition services for the upcoming school year. Those contracts with the 2 private schools, are those still moving forward? Because they are having students in school. Okay, thank you.
Other local funds, those are items such as our clubs and extracurriculars, items such as that. Nearly $1 million of the expenses in this area were for Learn 21, and we are the fiscal agent for that group. So Mr. Fritz and I continue to work together on monitoring of those funds, but they also, I think, saw a slight profit last year and some building up of their reserves as well. State and federal grants, nearly $4 million. Of that, we do oversee quite a bit of money for our non-public schools. About $2 million of that is auxiliary services funds that we oversee on behalf of Moeller, Ursuline, CHCA. So a lot of those dollars in federal and state don't even go to district operations. The majority of it is utilized for our non-public schools. Okay. So financial report number 1 down. Any questions before we move on to just an overview of what we're utilizing our COVID dollars for, or that impact? Okay. All right. I just wanted to start by, I think one of the things that has been very, very helpful for the district as we have been able to move forward with addressing these issues is that when we started this process of what did we need to do to provide the best environment for our students, for our staff, in approaching this year, you as a Board of Education, right from the very beginning, said we have a reserve, we need to do this right, you need to be able to utilize those funds to be able to support what's needed to support for the kids and our families in our community as well as our staff. So it's been one of those things that I have not heard in a lot of our neighboring districts, most often because they just don't have that availability of funds. But this is one of those situations where, you know, you think about what is the true emergency and what is the extremely appropriate use for budget reserve, and this is absolutely one of them. So it's been a great resource for us. It's one of those things that as we have tried to address the problem solving around this and think about what are the things that we need to keep our kids and our staff safe, we've been able to utilize those resources in a very thoughtful and I think effective way. So I really want to thank the board for that, Mr. Forstoffel, and your support of working through the budget issues and problem solving around that as well. So with that, let's look a little bit, and this is preliminary. This is through today. We think we've captured most of the needs that we have going forward. But we know that there's a lot that we don't know, and as time goes on, we will likely be adjusting this budget in support of the Healthy Back to School plan. So what we have so far is about $3.5 million allocated to this. Of that, $2.5 million is from our general fund reserve. So going back to some of those funds that we didn't spend last year that I think it's absolutely appropriate to utilize those for this year and to support our needs. Capital improvement budget, it's either in our business operations area and also in dollars allocated for technology. And then we have received over $500,000 in two different federal fund sources that are being overseen by the state of Ohio. And the good thing about that is in many cases, they have been able to relax some of the federal requirements, which has helped us be able to utilize those dollars in a much more effective way than sometimes what we are with the federal funds that we receive. Let's go on to the next thing. Okay. So in looking at the types of things, I think it may be, and we'll give you more information on this as we approve the appropriation for the district, and that'll be next month. But just to kind of give you an overview of the items that are being spent, or the items that are being supported in each one of these buckets, and the overall cost. We'll go through those really quickly. Probably the biggest item at about $1.5 million is for staffing, and that's for about 25 additional positions to support both the face-to-face and virtual instructional models. We are providing some dedicated substitutes to our buildings so that they have consistent people within the building as opposed to day-to-day subs. Now, we're still going to have some of that, but at least they do have people that they can assign that they know will not be traveling from building to building. We are also going to have to potentially look at providing some additional support in our classified staff areas, hopefully to get some additional personnel to help us with our custodial and cleaning duties and activities so we can continue to provide a clean environment. And then one of the things that is on the personnel consent agenda this evening is some additional extended time to bring in some of our counselors and groups that really help with a lot of the scheduling and have been needed to really kind of start from the beginning on how we make sure that we have our kids and our staff all assigned to both of those two models. In some cases where it's almost like they're running a schedule for two schools as opposed to just the one that they typically do. So that's a kind of an overview of some of the staffing needs that we have identified. We'll continue to make you aware of those items that we see as additional staffing needs. And the one thing that you will see when those are approved on the agenda is they are tied to COVID-type needs, and we do identify those on the agenda. One of the things that I know as we've talked through this is that has been very helpful from the board and having the support to do this is that we knew that one of our key issues in moving forward this year was just going to be space. We're trying to accommodate the physical distancing requirements, but yet also provide room for our staff to be able to collaborate effectively, to provide support of instruction. And so one of the ideas that you've supported, and we approved this, I believe, at last month's board meeting, is just the rental of a facility, one that we'd already rented part of for Aves Academy, to provide a space for several of our staff to be able to be in one place for our virtual classroom facility. So we have some costs due with rental, a little bit with furnishings, and actually one of the things that we were able to do based on a tip that we got from the city of Blue Ash is they hooked us up with a company that wanted to get rid of some furnishings, and they donated them. So we basically paid just for the transportation to get them here and some setup costs. So we were able to get some donations. So we continue to reach out to the cities every now and then when we see needs come up to see if they have some contacts within our corporate community, and we'll continue to do that. You've heard a lot. Mr. Forstoffel talked about the live stream environment. One of the things that Mr. Fritz brought up right away is that it's great to have all the equipment, it's great to have the intent, but if you don't have the bandwidth to make it happen, and it's going to be slow and maybe fail, you're going to have issues around that. So we are going to be paying for an upgrade to our broadband to support that. And then custodial supplies, PPE, some additional equipment to assist with some of the deep cleaning that we will be doing more frequently in all of our buildings. Temperature scanning equipment so that we can make sure that as students come in, we can, as efficiently as possible, as well as our staff, check some of their symptoms just before they even go into the building. But it helps us to be able to do that more efficiently than just using the hand thermometers. So many things that are going to need to take place to be able to open our doors here in the next couple of weeks.
Can I ask, before you get off that page, what's the breakdown of the other categories for the facility rental and just the other, you had three other, you said 1.5 million for the staffing, and there's another $1 million spread across the other three categories?
Yeah, the remaining categories, well, the 1.5 was for the teaching and instruction.
Right.
Then there's an additional about $500,000 for other subs, items like that, the subs and the classified staff, and the remaining dollars are for the other PPE non-personnel type items.
Okay, so facility rental, broadband, and PPE was the balance.
Broadband is like 50,000.
Okay,
The
thank
PPE is pretty significant
Thank
cost
you.
as well. Okay. All right. From the capital improvement budget, one of the things that we purchased was most of our elementary classroom furniture was tables that you couldn't effectively do physical distancing within those areas. So we did have to buy some classroom desks. When this is all said and done, we'll be able to utilize those in the classroom in the future and replace some of our older furniture, but we did need to do that. The tech wiring is for to make sure that we brought the new space for the virtual classroom addition up to speed to be able to support the technology needs in that area. If you recall, Mr. Fritz was on top of things with getting us technology bundles so that those can be used either for our virtual classroom teachers But I think probably more importantly from one of the things that we learned this spring is that should we need to go remote, those are items that our teachers will be able to pick up with them and take with them should they need to work from home if we go into that mode. So we do have those additional support ancillary items to support our Chromebooks and regular technology. So that was a great item, good foresight by Mr. Fritz to be able to do that. And then also, again, the live stream equipment that we talked about that's allowing us to provide most of our courses, if not maybe almost all of our courses at the high school and junior high level with our staff, typically through just a combination of teaching some sections face-to-face, some sections virtually, and sometimes teaching, for those that are kind of singleton classes, sometimes teaching both at the same time. So that's been a good investment in being in allowing some equity for our students and their access to our curriculum. Okay. The next one. Okay. A little bit more information about how we have utilized the federal funds that are available. There are basically two buckets: the CARES Act, which is $258,000. You may recall we provided free summer school for our students in need of intervention services to help fill some of those gaps for those students who are more at risk in needing academic help. Some dollars that we utilize for curriculum development to support being able to provide Sycamore developed curriculum for both our virtual classroom and then if needed in our remote model as well. One of the items that we needed to look at for our students with disabilities is that it was necessary for our special ed department to look at recovery planning and services. So additional work was needed with our families to determine what were those gaps that our students with disabilities had to be able to help with closing those gaps. And so there was some additional work that our therapists and our teachers have been working on in the last couple of weeks to help and work with our families to identify those items, and then eventually it's likely that we'll need to provide some additional services. And again, anytime that we had a little bit of money available, we put it right into custodial supplies and PPE. So you'll see that over and over again as an absolute need to be able to keep people safe within the building. And then the last item, okay. There's been a second bucket of federal funds released within the last month or so, and we are utilizing those again for many of the same items. Continued curriculum development. I believe the teachers have been doing that here in the last couple of weeks to bring that virtual classroom model and remote learning curriculum into sync and to be ready for when kids come back to school. One of the things that as our community with the diversity that we have to make sure that we accommodate is translating different items that may be associated with this plan, so that we allocated some dollars out of this grant to translate the Healthy Back to School plan, because that was something that our families needed to be able to access in order to make decisions about their children. We're funding a portion of the virtual classroom administrator out of this grant. Mr. Forstoffel talked a little bit about some of the mental health services that we're providing both for parent sessions as well as for our staff. One of the things that has come up, and this is really for all of our students, is continued looks at digitized instructional materials and tools. So, for example, the English language arts reading and writing curriculum that we used. We have upgraded to get it in digitized format and that will be used in both of those learning environments. So it's not just for the virtual classroom, it's for both. We've had to get some digitized materials for our music programs, and those will be used across the district to be able to provide those programs to our students. We're getting things like a lockdown browser to help with assessment. So been able to really utilize these tools for items that, we may end up using some of these in the future, but they're really important now as we move forward. And again, the custodial supplies and PPE. Okay. So with that, you'll see it's an exhaustive list. We find out new things every day that we need to be able to support both the instructional programming as well as the safety of our students, and to be able to also support the safety of our staff. So we'll continue to provide you updates, and thank you again for your support in providing the resources so that we can bring our kids back to school. And for those families that choose to have a virtual option, we can provide them great programming as well. So thank you.
Mrs. Weber, thank you so much for detailing that out. As I think every board member would agree, that is money well spent as we prepare to open up our buildings. The question I have is that, our board has always made a commitment to stay within certain financial parameters. And since we're going to be outside of that this year, is there anything that we need to do in terms of passing any type of resolution or acknowledgement that we are doing that?
And,
I think the question, Mrs. Weber, is do we need to do a formal resolution with the board, considering we're going to be outside of our communicated financial parameters?
No, we don't need to do it.
Ms. Weber, my question is, and I may have missed it, are any of those funds allocated to outside professional development, or is all the professional development in-house?
I think at this point in time, the only thing that's for outside professional development is to support one of the mental health programs. But I believe, and Mrs. Neighbor can probably comment on this more, I think most of our professional development is being coordinated by our own staff.
That's correct. All of the external trainers come from either Cincinnati Children's Hospital or from 1 in 5 or one of the other agencies that we do business with regarding mental health.
If that need would come up, it would be something that we could address. But at this point
I
in
think
time,
I'm thinking more along the lines of, as we engage in virtual classroom and live streaming and that kind of engagement. Mrs. Wegener said how important it is to engage students in whatever the delivery model, to make sure that our staff has proper PD to make sure that that's successful.
yeah. Well, I think we are getting some support from Learn 21 for those items. And you know what? The problem is Learn 21 lives in our building, and you forget that they're really an outside organization. But that would be one area where we're seeing some outside professional development from a group that provides support of the virtual classroom environment and online learning in other areas. So I don't know if that's kind of what you were referring to potentially.
It is, but I just want us to all be aware that, it starts stacking up. There's a lot on
Now,
Learn
Mr. Lewis,
21.
you may have had some professional development provided from the outside sources for your custodians, but those are typically the suppliers of those items. But you've had some outside training, I think, to support some of the work that they're doing to make sure they're using it appropriately. But
Okay.
Mrs. Weber, you've mentioned a couple times the appreciation for the board but I want to take a moment to thank you for the reserve position. You've played a big role in the financial reserve that we have available to us so that we can spend it. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank you because the reserve position doesn't happen by accident. It takes good fiscal stewardship, and I wanted to appreciate you for that.
Yeah, and Mrs. Weber, relative to the federal funds, do we have any obligation to report back on how that was spent, either directly to the grants that came in and/or doing our audits? Will any of that get covered by future audits as to how we spent the federal funding?
The federal funds are administered by the Ohio Department of Education, and we have to go through an application process. It's really similar to the application process that we utilize for our other federal funds. And then we will have to provide a final expenditure report as well as a budget update associated with that. It will be audited, much like our other federal funds are, that you've been familiar with that as we've gone through the audit process. They'll be part of not this year's audit in all likelihood, but next year's audit. And they'll look at things like, is it an appropriate public expenditure? One of the grants has a bit more, there are a few more restraints around it than the other, so they'll have to look at things like that. The CRF grant is just through December, so they'll make sure, one of the things that we'll have to do is provide our update to ODE on how those funds were utilized by that date. So there are still federal reporting requirements associated with that. We do have to, as far as like the county or whatever, they are included in things like our appropriation measure, and we also have to get a certification by the county auditor that we have those resources available for expenses. So a couple different areas that would have to be reported to the feds.
And I noticed some of the commodities are common across some of the spending categories, some of the PPE stuff and things like that. Do you have to buy in separate purchase orders to keep them separate, or do you have to worry about commingling funds as you buy
We
stuff?
do. We're doing a couple different ways. Within our general fund budget, we've created a separate tracking code so that we can keep track of what we've spent that's more so associated with things that we are doing that are above and beyond. So we're doing that in both the general fund and within separate accounting for all of our federal funds. So yes, we are tracking that so that we can, number one, I think it's important because, I'm certainly hopeful that these are going to be 1 year expenses. So we want to make sure that we know what we should anticipate we can carve out of our budget for next year. So we're absolutely keeping track of that for that reason. Also, in looking at the contract we have with the community, I think what we're going to see is because of these expenses, we're going to go above that, what would typically be our expense pattern. So we're going to need to be able to communicate that fully to our residents, to our taxpayers, so that they can see why we went above that. And that's part of our, when you look at that resolution as it was originally approved, one of the things that it does say is that if we're going to go above that trend, that we have to have the board approve that. And so we will have that in probably in our next, when we approve the appropriation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Weber. I need a motion for the approval of the personnel consent agenda.
So moved?
Second?
Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Is that Mr. Evans or Mr. Ballant?
Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Ballant?
Aye.
Mr.
Yeah, I
Mercurio?
have a
Oh,
question, though.
I'm
Before
sorry. Can we
do
hold
we
on?
have questions on this?
Typically, we do not, but is it a general question?
Well, it has to do with, a question I was asking on the supplementals. And that came in here as far as approving the supplementals back in June when we were finalizing the year-end numbers, or back in July. I'd asked Mrs. Weber, did we have to put anything in the supplemental contracts? Because we were planning on changing some of the evaluation of that, and we decided not to do anything at that time, and we were going to follow up in the fall about, you know, how we were going to handle the supplementals. And right now, that's an open question as to, you know, how we're going to handle the supplemental reviews going forward. Because that was an April commitment to get that done, and we're about to approve them, and I still don't understand that process.
Okay. Anyone else on the board? Mr. Forstoffel, can we schedule something at a future meeting to discuss that?
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Just tell me when, Mrs. Weiss.
Okay. I think we're going to go forward with the vote, and then we'll get that on an agenda in the next month to talk about that process and get an evaluation.
Are we going to get
system.
that done this year, this semester? I mean, that's what we committed to in April. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Right, and so is the evaluation process on the supplementals for the last, are you talking about for the last year, or are you talking about going forward?
Going forward, yeah.
Okay.
As we go, you know, but we're about to start the year, you know.
Right,
And,
okay. Why don't we put that on a morning work agenda? I think we can put that as a topic for Mr. Forstoffel. I think you and I can talk offline about the timing of that, and then we'll go forward with the vote tonight, and then we can get that on an agenda in the future so that we can actually get the evaluations done in this coming year. Anything else from the board? Okay, Mrs. Weber, please call the vote.
Mr. Ballant,
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio,
Aye.
Mrs. Weiss,
Aye.
Mr. Comerford,
Aye.
and Mr. Evans.
Aye.
Motion passes. Okay, other Board of Education business, legislative liaison report, Mr. Mercurio?
Yeah, I don't have anything else. I don't know if Mrs. Weber has anything.
The only thing I would maybe add on the legislative front is that they did name Representative Cupp as the Speaker of the House. I think that'll be a good thing. I think he seems very supportive of schools. He was the author of some of the school funding legislation, or a bill. It didn't get through the House last year, but you know, thinking about him being in that seat as they go through the budget process next spring, depending on what resources they think they may have available, that may be a really good thing for public schools in Ohio. So.
Yeah, I'd agree. He has a long term commitment to public schools. It started with CUP report many decades ago, so he's a good one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sycamore Advisory Commission update, Mr. Comerford?
Yeah, just a short update. We have agreed, the SAC has agreed to start our first meeting on October 12th, which is a month delayed than normal. This just allows us to get a little bit of runway to conclude what are the topics we want to cover. What that implies is we'll likely have 4 presentations starting February, March, April, and May versus the 5 we typically do. But we felt like that was the best move forward. So I just wanted to relay that to the board. Secondly, the foundations, public school educational foundations that we originally had on the agenda for July but had to move given the other priority topics in July. We were hopeful to have in September, but I think we're going to have to look for an alternative in October because the presentation team is not available on our Board of Education meeting night in September. So I just wanted to share that as well.
Mm-hmm. I just typed that into my to-do list to make sure we get that on the October meeting schedule. Thank you, Mr. Comerford. Mr. Forstoffel, strategic planning update.
Sure, we continue to make great progress with our strategic planning. The team met within the last week or two and really finalized and did one final look at the documents, including the annual goals and objectives. We reviewed and did some prioritization of that. We looked at the portrait of a graduate and kind of did a review of that. We are waiting for some cleanup from LEI, and at that point, Mrs. Weiss, maybe you and I can talk a little bit about how we bring that to the full board for review. So, Mr. Mercurio, I think that pretty well gets it, right?
Yep.
Good
covered it
session.
well. It was excellent.
Yep, great session. We're getting there. We're close.
And can I just ask a quick question?
Yep.
In that strategic planning document, is there a section for talent review? That was something that we were talking about doing in the fall. Is that part of that?
It's in there, but I'm not sure exactly what the timeline around that is. I
Okay.
will forward those documents to you to look at.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
referenced in there, Mr. McCure, but I don't know where we've
Yeah, I don't
we've
think-
landed it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's specific outline or goal.
Yeah,
for
and that
this
may have to wait
first
until Miss LEI sends us the cleaned up documents. But as soon as I get them, I'll send them to you.
Okay, great, thanks.
But we had that on a board calendar for October, didn't we?
Yeah,
When
that-
we laid the board calendar out in the spring?
That's what I remembered, but let's take a look at that, and figure out when we're gonna do that. But yeah, it was for October, correct?
Yeah. I don't know why we'd pull out the schedule. I mean, it's a standalone module for anything we talk about. We keep missing dates on stuff.
Okay, let's take a look at that and see what we have on that for the strategic planning piece. Okay, moving on to the OSB Capital Conference. As you know, it's going to be virtual this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The dates are November 8th to the 10th. We need to now appoint an OSBA delegate and alternate to represent our school district at the conference. So I will now open the floor to Mr. Mercurio. You look like you're ready to. I can't see your face, but it looks like you're ready to speak.
I'm just looking at the newest board member over there. Usually gets the honor for this one.
I think
If
Mr.
willing.
Evans had the same idea.
Well, I did actually brief Mr. Comerford just about, some of the background of what this was and some of the benefits of just understanding the broader OSBA platform as it goes forward. I think this year it'll actually be a light duty load, being able to do it remote versus having to go up there and do it. So I would at least say there's a beneficial element to doing it until you can get someone else elected.
I'm willing to serve in that capacity, and I look at it as a good learning opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Comerford. We also need an election of an alternate.
I can be an alternate.
Oh, you can be okay, great. Mr. Ballant will be the alternate. I need a motion for the approval of designating Mr. Comerford as our OSB delegate and Mr. Ballant as our alternate.
So moved.
Second?
Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
Mr. Ballant,
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio,
Aye.
Mr. Comerford,
Aye.
Mr. Evans,
Aye.
and Mrs. Weiss.
Aye, motion passes. I now need a motion to go into executive session in accordance with ORC 121.22G1, employment dismissal, evaluation, compensation, appointment, and discipline of a public employee, official, or regulated individual.
So moved.
Mrs. Weber, please call the roll.
It was Mr. Ballant made
Aye.
a motion, right? And Mr. Comerford? Okay, Mr. Evans? Okay, Mr. Evans? Okay, Mr. Comerford?
Aye.
Mr. Mercurio?
Aye.
And Mrs. Weiss.
Aye. Motion passes. We do not expect a vote after that. Thank you.